blood that refused to stop, bandages that drowned in seconds, and a material so absorbent that it saved more wounded men than any surgeon on the Western Front. A material born from explosions, amputations, and panic. A material that later slipped quietly into bathroom cabinets around the world. The same invention that kept soldiers alive became the foundation of a global taboo, and the product you know today was never designed for comfort. It was designed for war. This is the part of the story that was erased. And it begins with something no medical textbook wanted to admit. Blood loss, not bullets, killed most soldiers in the early years of the First World War. Arteries severed by shrapnel emptied faster than doctors could clamp them. Field medics ran out of clean cloth faster than supply trucks could deliver it. Every trench hospital lived in a permanent state of shortage. Gauze came soaked, stained, reused until its fibers fell apart. Infection followed every wound like a shadow. Surgeons begged for something better, something cleaner, something that could absorb more than a handful of cotton ever could. But nothing existed. Not yet. Far behind the trenches, inside factory floors lit by humming electric lamps, a team of researchers at Kimberly-Clark worked on a military problem unrelated to medicine. They weren't trying to save limbs. They weren't thinking about nurses or battlefield hospitals. They were building paper. More specifically, a new kind of cellulose for ammunition and machinery. A thick, pulpy material designed to be durable, cheap, and disposable. The military wanted a synthetic fiber that could replace expensive cotton used in everything from filters to gas mask components. The researchers cooked wood pulp, pressed it, stretched it, and chemically altered its structure. What they created looked harmless. White sheets, feather light, almost flimsy. But the sheets behaved unlike anything the Army Medical Department had ever seen. When soaked in liquid, the new material didn't sag. It didn't crumble. It didn't dissolve. It expanded. It absorbed 20 times its weight. Kimberly-Clark called it cellucotton. The company thought it would become an industrial product. They never imagined it would move through the trenches of Europe like contraband. The military noticed immediately. Cotton was scarce. War consumed raw materials faster than global supply chains could replace them. Cellucotton looked like a solution to a logistics nightmare. By 1915, crates of the material were tested in field stations as padding for gas mask filters and insulation for equipment. But the first people to understand its real potential were not chemists or officers. They were nurses. Trench hospitals operated in a storm of blood, mud, and screaming. Every stretcher arrived dripping. Every table became slick. There were never enough bandages, never enough hands, never enough time. Wounds from artillery shrapnel were jagged, deep, catastrophic. Limbs tore open, muscle shredded. Cotton pads soaked through in seconds. Nurses wrapped, pressed, tied, and watched red seep through the layers. They replaced a bandage, then replaced the replacement, then grabbed whatever cloth remained. Blood loss was measured not in milliliters, but in handfuls. In late 1915, the Red Cross received a shipment of cellucotton sheets. They were meant for cleaning equipment, a simple, practical use. But nurses tore them apart and realized something extraordinary. A pad of cellucotton absorbed blood instantly, faster than cotton, faster than wool, faster than any medical material they had ever seen. A single sheet replaced dozens of gauze rolls. A wounded soldier who would have bled out in minutes suddenly had a chance. Improvised pads appeared everywhere. In clearing stations, in makeshift tents, in field hospitals dug into the sides of muddy embankments. Nurses stuffed cellucotton into wounds, packed it under tourniquets, and layered it beneath splints. They held it against arterial spray, watching it swell and hold. The material didn't break. It didn't leak. It didn't disintegrate. It worked. The casualty reports reflected the change. Soldiers who would have died from shock survived long enough for transport. Evacuation teams carried fewer corpses and more semi-conscious men. Medics scribbled notes about the new cotton substitute, unsure of what it was, but desperate to get more. Surgeons wrote that it was remarkably absorbent, cleaner than standard cotton, unusually effective in controlling blood flow. None knew the name. None cared. They needed it. Kimberly-Clark sent more. By 1916, tons of Celicotton entered the Western Front. Hospitals built entire storage rooms dedicated to it. Some nurses shaped it into thick pads for chest wounds. Others folded it into long strips for wrapping shattered limbs. It became indispensable. It became life-saving. It became normal. And then something happened that the medical officers never expected. Nurses, exhausted, overworked, surrounded by blood, made a private discovery. Celicotton was not only useful for battlefield trauma, it also worked on their own bodies. Women serving in the Red Cross realized the material was far more absorbent, far more discreet, and far more reliable than the rags and cloth they had been forced to use their entire lives. Menstruation was not discussed, not in hospitals, not in training manuals, not in mixed company, but the frontline nurses shared knowledge in whispers. They cut small rectangles of Celicotton, folded them, secured them with makeshift belts, and for the first time, they had a disposable product that didn't need to be washed, hidden, or reused. This was never recorded in official reports. No document written by military men would ever mention it. But diaries from nurses hinted at another use, a secret use, a private help. A way to stay clean during 12-hour shifts where running water was a luxury and privacy was impossible. The taboo around menstruation was so strong that the discovery stayed underground. But the women knew. They told each other quietly, behind screens, behind medical tents, in corners of crowded field hospitals. And at some point, no one remembers exactly when, the news reached supply officers. They noticed nurses requesting more Celicotton than battlefield procedures justified. They noticed that the material disappeared in quantities that didn't match surgical demand. Someone understood. Someone looked the other way. That silence cemented the beginning of an industry. When the war ended in 1918, the demand for Celicotton collapsed overnight. Stockpiles filled warehouses. Military contracts evaporated. Kimberly-Clark faced a commercial problem. Millions of pounds of a miracle material with no buyer. Entire production lines risked shutdown. Workers faced layoffs. The company had one question: what do we do with a product that was built for war but no longer needed by the military? The answer came from the nurses. Kimberly-Clark executives began hearing stories, quietly, awkwardly, about the other use of their product at the front. Women who returned from war wrote to the company asking if Celicotton was available for personal purchase. Red Cross nurses mentioned it during debriefings. A few even visited stores asking for it, only to be met with confusion. Executives realized something radical. Women wanted a product that society refused to name. A product that had never existed before the war because no man had ever considered making it. A product based on a material that was born from blood, trauma, and survival. Kimberly-Clark decided to commercialize Celicotton as a disposable menstrual pad. They called it Kotex. The name sounded clinical, modern, almost sterile. A combination of cotton-like texture and technology, but introducing it to the public was another war entirely. Advertisements could not mention blood, could not show a woman using the product, could not say the word menstruation, could not explain what the product actually did. Stores did not want to stock it. Clerks did not want to touch it. Newspapers refused to print ads unless the language was sanitized to the point of absurdity. The first advertisement merely said, Kotex, a new woman's product. Ask your dealer. Most dealers had no idea what they were supposed to be selling. Women walked to counters and whispered the name. Clerks pretended not to hear. Boxes were wrapped in plain paper. Transactions were silent. Sales were discreet. But word spread. Women bought it. Women told friends. Nurses endorsed it unofficially. And slowly, very slowly, the idea of a disposable menstrual pad entered civilian life. The irony was brutal. A product designed to stop battlefield bleeding took decades to become socially acceptable because the public considered its new use impolite. The very thing that saved soldiers' lives had to be hidden when women needed it. By the early 1920s, Kotex gained traction in urban centers. Department stores carried it behind counters. Some allowed women to leave coins in a box without speaking to male clerks at all. It was a workaround for shame. A hack against embarrassment. But it worked. The global transformation had begun. Kotex was the first truly mass-produced disposable hygiene product in modern history. It was not invented in a lab for comfort. It was engineered in war for blood management. And its existence forced industries to confront the reality that half the population needed products the other half refused to discuss. The world changed quietly at first. Factories expanded, chemical processes improved, companies experimented with layering, shaping, and packaging. The taboo didn't disappear, but it fractured. Advertising agencies learned how to imply without explaining. Women learned how to ask without speaking. Men learned to sell a product they pretended not to understand. And through all of this, the origin remained buried. No one wanted to say that menstrual pads came from battlefield carnage. No one wanted to explain that the material sitting in bathroom cabinets worldwide had once soaked up the blood of dying soldiers. No one wanted to admit that a global industry was built on a discovery made accidentally, by nurses who simply needed something clean during the worst days of their lives. But the truth stayed inside old reports, old letters, old purchase logs. Kotex began as a war bandage, a life-saving military invention, a product of desperation, not design. And that truth is where the story deepens again, because the impact didn't stop at hospitals or bathrooms. It reshaped medicine. It reshaped industrial chemistry. It reshaped how society understood and ignored the physical realities of women's bodies. And it created a new kind of consumer product that would eventually dominate the world. But none of that was visible yet in the early 1920s. Back then, the story was still small, still fragile, still whispered, still taboo. The world had no idea what was coming next. The 1920s opened with an uncomfortable truth. The war had ended, but its inventions had not. Cellucotton was still stacked in warehouses, silent, sterile, waiting. America didn't know what to do with millions of pounds of a material engineered for bleeding. Hospitals wanted only a fraction of what had once been required. Military contracts evaporated. Factories that had run 24 hours a day during the war now risked shutting down. Kimberly-Clark faced a choice: abandon the material or turn it into something the world had never openly discussed. They chose the second path, but they stepped into it carefully, almost reluctantly. No company had ever marketed a product for menstruation at national scale. There were no guidelines, no playbooks. Only a problem: half the population needed something they weren't allowed to talk about. The first Kotex advertisements tiptoed around reality. They used phrases like delicate needs and important comforts. They showed nurses in crisp white uniforms, carefully avoiding any image that hinted at blood. They sold an unspeakable product without describing it, trusting that women who knew would understand and women who didn't would ask quietly. And yet, even with these cautious steps, backlash formed immediately. Men who ran drugstores objected, clerks refused to handle the boxes. Newspapers rejected ad copy for being improper. Some cities debated whether displaying Kotex in shop windows was indecent. Women, meanwhile, felt the weight of old restrictions pressing down again. They walked into stores with their heads low, whispered the product name, and hoped male clerks wouldn't ask questions. Kotex wasn't simply fighting for shelf space. It was fighting for cultural permission. By 1922, more than 1 million boxes had been sold. By 1923, that number doubled. The demand was unmistakable. Women wanted disposability. They wanted cleanliness. They wanted relief from washing cloth rags in secret, drying them in hidden corners, disguising them from family and neighbors. Kotex offered a new kind of freedom, quiet but powerful. But selling freedom in silence created a paradox. The product changed lives, yet no one could say why. Kimberly-Clark analyzed consumer patterns and discovered something surprising. Women weren't buying Kotex from druggists as expected. They were buying it from department stores, specifically from saleswomen. Women trusted women with the transaction. A whispered request to a female clerk felt safer. By 1925, the company shifted strategy entirely and placed Kotex in women-run departments around the country. It worked. Sales grew again. But the material inside the box remained the same: Cellulocotton, the same substance that had once soaked up battlefield blood. Nurses recognized it instantly. Former Red Cross volunteers walked into stores, saw the soft white pads, and felt a jolt of familiarity. They remembered field hospitals. They remembered the smell of antiseptic mixed with mud. They remembered pressing cellulocotton into gaping wounds while shells exploded in the distance. They knew exactly where Kotex came from. The company did not advertise that origin. They avoided the subject for decades. The public preferred to see the product as modern, clean, sanitary, not as a relic of shellfire and shrapnel. But even as the civilian market grew, the scientific world took notice of cellulocotton for a different reason. Its absorbency changed the standards for medical supplies. Hospitals began using it for surgical dressings. Dentists used it for oral bleeding control. Veterinarians used it for animal surgery. Every field that needed sterile absorption adopted the material quietly, efficiently, permanently. A military invention had become universal. Then came the next unexpected transformation. As Kotex spread across the world, other companies realized something. Simple but revolutionary, disposability created continuous demand. Unlike cloth, a disposable product required regular replacement. Unlike cotton, it could be chemically engineered to perform in specific ways. Unlike traditional hygiene methods, it could be packaged, branded, marketed. A new industry was born. By the early 1930s, manufacturers experimented with variants. Thicker pads, thinner pads, pads with belts, pads with new binding fibers. Cellulose chemistry became a booming field. Scientists studied how wood pulp could be manipulated to create absorbency profiles tailored to different uses. The same principles that allowed Kotex to absorb menstrual blood could be applied to diapers, medical sponges, cleaning pads, industrial filters. One battlefield invention quietly seeded an entire century of disposable design. And yet the stigma surrounding menstruation prevented Kotex from celebrating its origin. The world wanted the product, but not the truth. Advertisements spoke in coded language. Women's magazines used euphemisms. Even product instructions avoided the real vocabulary. The most direct phrase in early Kotex literature was simply, "for feminine needs," a phrase designed to say everything and nothing. Behind factory doors, innovation continued. Kimberly-Clark developed improved cellulose fibers, refining the structure to hold liquid more efficiently. They experimented with bleaching, pressing, and layering. The pads became whiter, softer, lighter. They engineered fibers that trapped liquid inside internal chambers. They created new adhesives and new shapes. Kotex evolved constantly while hiding its violent ancestry. Then war returned. In 1939, Europe plunged into another conflict. The Second World War resurrected old medical shortages and battlefield wounds that looked almost identical to those seen in the trenches of the First World War. Once again, the military needed materials that could stop bleeding quickly. Once again, absorbency and sterility became matters of life and death. Cellulocotton re-entered military supply lines. Hospitals in Europe stocked it. American field medics trained with it. British medical officers imported it. The material that had saved lives in the First War saved thousands more in the Second. But the world had changed. This time, the consumer market didn't collapse. Women in allied nations continued buying Kotex even as the war shifted global resources. Manufacturers balanced military needs with civilian demand. Some factories converted temporarily to surgical bandage production. Others kept making consumer pads, believing that hygiene was essential even during wartime. By 1942, the U.S. government recognized the strategic importance of absorbent cellulose. It prioritized the production of materials related to medical care and women's hygiene, acknowledging, quietly, that both were critical to wartime stability. Women working in factories, on farms, and in offices needed reliability. Millions served in auxiliary forces. They needed products that allowed them to work without interruption. Kotex became part of national productivity. The taboo was still strong, but practicality was stronger. The war ended in 1945. Cellulocotton survived again. The product that began as a battlefield miracle had become a household staple across continents. But consumer habits shifted. Women demanded more privacy, more convenience, more comfort. They wanted products shaped to their bodies, not just pressed sheets. They wanted better packaging, better adhesives, better design. The industry responded with new formulas and new technologies. Plastic-backed pads, folded pads, packaged pads, discreet wrappers, odor control, retail aisles dedicated entirely to menstrual hygiene. The whispers of the 1920s became the quietly confident purchases of the 1950s. And every new product still descended from the same origin, a wartime need to control catastrophic bleeding. By the 1960s, the pharmaceutical and consumer goods industries recognized the power of cellulose and polymer science. They developed superabsorbent polymers, crystals that could hold hundreds of times their weight in liquid. These polymers built on the logic first demonstrated by silicone, that absorption could be engineered, not improvised. These innovations reshaped everything from diapers to surgical pads to household cleaners. Kotex remained at the center of the transformation. Kimberly-Clark invested in materials science laboratories, industrial-scale chemical plants, and global distribution networks. They turned cellulose into a commodity. They turned women's hygiene into an industry measured in billions. And then billions more. Consumers never saw the connection between modern pads and their battlefield ancestor. The packaging featured flowers, clouds, blue droplets, smiling models, clean imagery, soft imagery, nothing that hinted at trenches, gangrene, or tourniquets. The real story hid beneath layers of marketing. But scientific papers and internal memos still contained clues. Researchers compared absorption rates using the same metrics used by wartime surgeons. Engineers referenced the old silicone formulation when designing new fibers. Even the shape of modern pads echoed the rectangles cut by nurses in 1916. The product you know today is the descendant of improvised battlefield bandages. Then the industry expanded again. Global markets opened. Companies shipped Kotex and similar products across Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East. Disposable hygiene became part of international development. Governments invested in menstrual health programs. NGOs distributed pads in schools. Anthropologists studied the effect of hygiene access on education and employment. Every study pointed to the same conclusion. Access to disposable pads gave women more control over mobility, labor, and privacy. The effect was quantifiable. Girls missed fewer school days. Women missed fewer workdays. Hygiene stability improved economic outcomes on national scale. A wartime invention reshaped global gender dynamics. But the story did not stay clean. With mass production came mass waste. Billions of pads filled landfills every year. Environmental scientists raised concerns about plastic components, chemical treatments, and non-biodegradable fibers. Companies began researching organic cotton alternatives, biodegradable cellulose blends, compostable wrappers. The technology that once saved lives now demanded reinvention for a different kind of survival. And through all of this, every innovation, every change, one fact remained buried. The modern menstrual pad was never designed for menstruation. It was designed for amputation, for shrapnel wounds, for bleeding that refused to stop. A product created in response to the most violent conditions on Earth became something sold in pastel boxes with cursive lettering. The contrast is astonishing. Yet the more astonishing truth is the scale of impact. Silicone saved soldiers in 2 world wars. Kotex changed women's health permanently. Disposable hygiene products became a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And nearly every modern disposable absorbent product, from diapers to incontinence, pads to surgical dressings, descends from that original war-born material. Millions of people use these products daily without ever knowing that they began in trenches filled with mud, blood, and terror. Without knowing that the quiet, routine act of opening a pad at home traces back to nurses improvising under fire. Without knowing that one of the most common products on Earth emerged from the same historical conditions that destroyed entire generations. And this hidden lineage reveals something else. Many everyday products owe their existence to war, not peace, to injury, not comfort, to emergency innovation, not careful design. As the decades rolled on, Kotex became synonymous with menstrual care. Competitors entered the market. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated. Feminist movements questioned advertising tropes. Product designs diversified. And still the original story stayed silent, tucked away in military memos and manufacturing archives. But understanding the origin changes how we see the product. It exposes the forgotten cost behind advancement. It reveals how necessity drives invention, and how invention reshapes society in ways no one anticipates. It shows that even the items we consider ordinary carry histories filled with violence, desperation, and ingenuity. Cellulose was supposed to stop soldiers from dying. Kotex was supposed to provide women a clean, private solution. Today, the material sits in billions of homes, offices, schools, and hospitals. Few objects have traveled so far from their origin, and fewer still have left such a wide, unseen trail across human lives. The story is not finished yet. The impact continues, and the final transformation is still unfolding. The modern world rarely stops to examine the origins of the ordinary. A box of pads on a supermarket shelf does not hint at its ancestry. No packaging whispers of trenches or nurses or soldiers who survived because a sheet of engineered cellulose stopped the bleeding long enough for transport. No marketing campaign mentions the field hospitals built on mud, soot, and urgency. No instruction leaflet alludes to amputations carried out by trembling hands under dim lantern light. Consumers see a product of comfort, a product of routine, a product wrapped in soft colors and unobtrusive language. But beneath the surface sits a chain of decisions forged by crisis, by scarcity, by necessity. And when we trace that chain backward, we arrive at a time when the world was collapsing under its own mechanized violence. When millions of young men were dying not from bullets, but from the unstoppable flood of their own blood. The First World War reshaped medical science at breakneck speed. New weapons created new wounds. New wounds demanded new solutions. Cellulose was one of those solutions, an industrial experiment repurposed. On the front lines by people desperate to keep others alive. Its design was simple. Its impact was enormous. Its transformation into a global hygiene product was unforeseen. But war has always accelerated innovation. The difference here is the direction of that innovation. Most wartime inventions migrate from military use into civilian technology with their original purpose intact. Radar became aviation control. Penicillin became standard medicine. Jet engines became commercial airliners. Cellulose followed a different path. It went from bloodshed to privacy. From the public horror of war to the private reality of monthly biology. From the loudest environment imaginable to the quietest. From emergency trauma to everyday life. And that shift exposes something deeper. Societies are shaped not only by what they choose to create, but also by what they choose to hide. For decades, the makers of Kotex avoided discussing the product's origin. They never mentioned that its first purpose was to stop soldiers from bleeding to death. They never acknowledged the nurses who discovered its versatility under dire circumstances. They never placed the product's history alongside the technologies usually celebrated for their wartime ingenuity. Instead, they softened the story. They sanitized it. They erased the blood. What remained was a product that crossed continents, languages, and cultures. A product that billions of people would rely on without ever learning that it was originally intended to plug shrapnel wounds. The story became invisible, but the impact never did. As the decades unfolded, menstrual hygiene products evolved along predictable lines. First, the belt apparatus disappeared. Then came adhesive-backed pads, then wings, then ultra-thin materials, then gels, then new polymers, then breathable layers, then biodegradable blends. Each generation layered innovation over innovation, each step distancing itself further from the original battlefield invention while still depending on its basic logic: absorb, retain, protect. Behind the scenes, the chemistry changed dramatically. Cellulose became refined, bleached, treated, engineered, shaped. Companies learned how to align fibers to increase capillary action. They developed superabsorbent granules that swelled into gel-like masses when wet. They introduced barriers to control lateral spread. They built pads that could hold dozens of times their own weight. Some could withstand compression, movement, friction. The scientific complexity grew until the modern pad became an object more engineered than many consumer electronics. And yet, the core function remained identical to the one needed in war. Stop liquid from moving where it isn't supposed to go. Hold it. Contain it. Prevent loss. The similarity is uncomfortable but real. Hospitals saw the usefulness immediately. The same principles that made Kotex effective for menstruation made it indispensable for post-surgical bleeding control. Surgeons requested pads for recovery rooms. Dentists used small cellulose sponges after extractions. Veterinarians used them during operations. Emergency medical technicians kept them in trauma kits. And although they weren't designed for catastrophic wounds anymore, their lineage was unmistakable. Every box in a hospital storeroom carried the DNA of frontline improvisation. Then came the cultural shift of the late 20th century, a movement that challenged old taboos, demanded open conversations about menstruation, and pushed companies to abandon euphemisms. Kotex and its competitors began to change their messaging. They used accurate terminology. They acknowledged the biological purpose directly. They broke from the century-long tradition of silence. But even then, the original history was still missing, still buried, still considered too morbid, too strange, too incompatible with modern branding. It remained a footnote in industrial histories, a brief mention in old military supply documents, a passing observation in academic papers, rarely explored, almost never taught, and completely absent from public awareness. But understanding this origin reveals patterns hidden beneath the surface. It reveals that women's health has often advanced not through intentional design, but through accidents of circumstance, through leftover materials, through repurposed technologies, through innovations created for men that women adapted for themselves. It reveals that necessity often bypasses stigma long before society does. It reveals that even during war, ingenuity doesn't follow formal channels. It follows people, especially the ones forced to solve problems that official systems ignore. It reveals that progress is often improvised. And the improvisation that nurses performed on the Western Front created one of the most successful consumer products of the modern age. By the 21st century, the industry built on that improvisation is valued at tens of billions of dollars. Supply chains span continents. Production lines turn wood pulp into ultrafine fibers with staggering efficiency. Advertising campaigns reach billions. Menstrual products are used in every environment: homes, schools, workplaces, refugee camps, disaster zones, rural villages, underground transit systems, high-altitude expeditions. Few technologies have as large or as quiet a global footprint. And still the truth remains astonishingly simple. If not for World War I, menstrual pads as we know them would not exist. If not for shrapnel wounds, the absorbent material inside them would never have been invented. If not for nurses improvising in the chaos of trench hospitals, the product would never have been tested on the front lines. If not for the end of military contracts, companies would never have pivoted to consumer markets. If not for the taboo around menstruation, Kotex might never have gained its strange, whispered momentum. This chain of events, unpredictable, violent, accidental, reshaped global hygiene forever. A chain forged not in corporate strategy sessions or scientific conferences, but in the mud and panic of the Western Front. A chain that began with a question shouted across a field hospital: "Is there anything else clean to use?" A chain built by nurses ripping open crates labeled for machinery and realizing they held something far more valuable. A chain that turned emergency trauma material into a household staple. And when we realize how many ordinary products come from extraordinary origins, a deeper question emerges, one that echoes across history. How many objects in our daily lives were born not from inspiration, but from bloodshed? How many inventions came from the need to stop death rather than to enrich life? How many items we see as harmless were shaped by military demands, battlefield improvisation, or desperate logistics? We rarely ask these questions, but the answers surround us. Antibiotics, canned food, instant coffee, portable bandages, synthetic rubber, duct tape, superglue, GPS, jet engines, tampons, and yes, sanitary pads. War changes technology. Technology changes society, and society forgets where the change began. The story of Kotex is the perfect example. An industry built on silence, a product built on stigma, a history built on wounds. But here is the final irony. The thing designed to manage uncontrollable bleeding now lives in environments built for comfort, privacy, and routine. It sits inside drawers in quiet bedrooms, next to toothbrushes and floss. It travels inside purses, backpacks, and glove compartments. It occupies shelves in supermarkets, pharmacies, corner stores, airports, gas stations. It has become normal, common, unremarkable. And yet, beneath its quiet presence lies one of the most dramatic and brutal origin stories of any consumer product in the last century. A story hidden in military archives, in Red Cross journals, in supply lists, in factory records, in the memories of nurses who never received credit for what they discovered. A story made of blood, necessity, and the relentless force of human adaptability. A story that deserves to be remembered. Because when we strip away the silence, we see the full path of the invention. From battlefield bandages to bathroom cabinets. From shrapnel wounds to supermarket aisles. From improvised life-saving measures to a multi-billion-dollar global industry. From the worst the world can produce to something that quietly helps billions live their daily lives. And that raises the final question, the one this entire history leads to: how many everyday products in your home were born in the trauma of a war you never lived through? If you want to uncover the origins of ordinary things shaped by extraordinary violence, subscribe.